Right, excellent. I think we'll make a start. There's a few people joining, but I think we can get going. So, hi, welcome everybody. My name is Rhiannon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Swansea University webinar series about the climate emergency. I work in the admissions team in science and engineering, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Professor Stefan Doer, who will be giving tonight's talk, which is about climate change and the global wildfire crisis, unravelling myths from realities. Professor Doer is an academic in the Faculty of Science and Engineering with us, and he teaches on our geography undergraduate courses and postgraduate courses. And of course, he's also a world-renowned researcher on wildfire science. So Stefan's going to give the talk for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So during the session, if you've got any burning questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, which are the two little buttons below the screen, and we will try and answer them all at the end of the session. Obviously, Stefan can give any questions about his talk and wildfires, and I'm here if you have any questions about Swansea University, about the recruitment process, about entry requirements, or anything about studying here at Swansea. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Stefan and we'll get the talk underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhiannon, for the introduction and a warm welcome. Warm welcome to Swansea University. Here in the background, of course, it's evening already and doesn't really feel like a wildfire day, but let me assure you there are places around the world that are burning right now. So yeah, thank you for your interest. Let me share the screen. So I hope you can all see this. Okay, so climate change and the global wildfire crisis, unraveling, or at least I'm trying to unravel the myths from the realities about wildfire. Just a bit more of background regarding myself. So yes, I teach in geography here at Swansea University. We also have a Centre for Wildfire Research here in the UK. And we focus on research in different areas of the world. You will see some of this later on. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Wild and Fire. So this is the largest international journal, scientific journal, publishing research on wildfire. So essentially everything in relation to wildfire that's published in this journal comes across my desk for assessment and approval. So wildfire, I mean, we've all seen many things in the news about wildfires. Every year there are some horrific news items about wildfire. For example, 2018 in Mati in Greece, 102 people died in a tragic event in that relatively small town. Black Summer, Australia, not very long ago, 2019-20, their summer season, our winter, the largest forest area in recorded history has burned in Australia. So there were some very dramatic images, many animals killed, also quite a few people killed. And of course, it's been in the news all over the place. Here, the Siberia forest fires, a disaster, ecological disaster for the Arctic, carbon emissions from those areas. Amazon, Brazil is on fire. Ukraine, that's not long ago, we had wildfires in the exclusion zone in the Ukraine with radioactive material there and a concern that some of this material might re-emerge into the atmosphere. Lytton this summer, you will remember this, the hottest day ever recorded in Canada, and then a few days later the whole town burns down. Of course, California, there were many news about California as well, and it goes on and on. Every year we have plenty of news about wildfire. But fire on Earth is actually nothing new. Plants have co-evolved with fires for nearly 400 million years, so essentially a tenth of the Earth's history we had fire on the planet, and essentially as long as we had a continuous vegetation cover in some areas and a dry enough period for this to burn, fires did occur. Nowadays, fires burn between 3 to 4.6 billion square kilometers every year. And to put this into perspective, that's about 15 times the total UK land area, and that's every year. In other words, that's about 3 to 5% of the global vegetated land surface every year. So if you look at this from a generational perspective, so within the space of about 30 or so years, within the space of a generation, we have the equivalent of the total vegetated land surface burning in the space of a generation. Of course, not everything burns. Some areas burn frequently, others less frequent. We'll discuss this in a moment. But I've just downloaded the global fire activity from what's called a NASA Earth Viewer. I did this earlier. So here we have the week leading up to the date, up till the 29th of November. What you can see in red here, all these pixels, basically these red areas are areas where there are fires, and the fires that are detected by satellite, each of those that generates a pixel, which is actually slightly larger than the fire, hence Madagascar is really red, for example. But basically within that pixel, we have an area of at least 30 hectares burning. Otherwise, the fires wouldn't be detected. There's some small errors in it. For example, here we've got a few fires that seem to be the Atlantic, and these are basically very strong flames that are probably from oil platforms. But generally speaking, this is basically the global fire occurrence now, as we have the Northern Hemisphere autumn. But you can see, for example, here, this is the main fire season now for the savanna, Northern Hemisphere savanna in Africa. And do we hear about this in the news, for example? No, we might be hearing about the Amazon perhaps on fire, and of course fires in California, or some of the fires in Canada that are burning. But this, the largest area here, we don't hear anything about this. Now, to have a fire, of course we need fuel, and this is essentially dry vegetation, or the dry enough vegetation, and ignitions. And ignitions, we have plenty of those. Oops, sorry, that didn't. Yeah, here we go. We have plenty of ignitions from lightning in remote regions. Now, here in this relatively humid temperate climate in UK, we don't really associate lightning with fire. And in fact, we don't get that many lightning storms anyway in our oceanic climate. But if you move more continental, for example, parts of Russia, Canada, for example, or Eastern Europe, and even Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, ignitions from lightning are quite common. And often this lightning is not even associated with rainfall, whereas here, very rarely do we get any lightning that's not associated with rainfall. But of course, another cause of fire is either by accident or by arson. And this is the main cause essentially anywhere around the world in more densely populated areas. So here we have a typical example from the UK. You can see those two disposable barbecues, a very common way of causing a fire, not necessarily from the flames of the barbecue itself, but here you see somebody very smart has basically left the cardboard burning as well, where the barbecue is delivered with, and put the whole thing on fire. The bottom of the barbecue gets really, really hot in the fire. If you put this onto flammable material, almost inevitably it will start burning. So they come with these little metal frames. You should put them on, so they should be elevated from the ground and of course taken out of the cardboard box. That goes without saying. But of course, there are many other causes of fire by humans. For example, power lines. Sparks from power lines are often the causes of fire. There's a third cause, which is essentially intentional burning off the landscape for land managers' purposes. And this is very common, for example, in African savannas, in grasslands in South America, and savannas in Australia, for example. And for millennia, people have actually burned the savanna to maintain the grassland. The ash will basically provide nutrients for new grass growth. It's easier for hunting, for example, and you can get a better growth in the next wet season if you burn this. This is something that farmers have done for many, many centuries, also in the UK and in other areas in Europe, but this is now banned. But stubble burning used to be very common to increase the fertility of the soil. Now, if we look at a natural fire frequency, so fires that are caused by lightning, for example, we have some areas around the world, for example, the boreal forests of Canada, Alaska, of Siberia, and some temperate conifer forests, for example, the forests in the Western United States, which we hear so much about in the news. They typically naturally burn every 150 to 300 years, so much more than the typical human memory. If we then move to the Australian eucalyptus forest, this is probably the most fire-adapted forest we have anywhere in the world. It naturally burns, roughly speaking, every 30 years or so. So within a generation, a person living near a eucalypt forest might actually see this burn. And then we have the, oops, I'm sorry, it's not switching the way I thought. So every 1 to 5 years, we have the savanna grasses burning, partially because of human ignitions, because of management, but also due to lightning. Because the savanna grasses, they die off in every dry season, they become flammable, and they regrow the next year. So if you have ignitions, which are common in this area, we'll get fires every few years or so. And this is why we now see in the satellite image, for example, Northern Hemisphere Africa in a pretty red status on that satellite map. Now, if we come back to our boreal forests, here's an example from Northwest Canada. This is a few days after a fire. You can see the blackened areas. This is an image I took out of a helicopter, and these are called stand replacing fires. So that means the trees are killed. Again, this happens every 150 to 300 years, but this is perfectly normal. The trees themselves, whilst they're being killed, the vegetation as such is adapted to fire. And the way it's adapted is basically the trees are making space for the new generation, and they have cones that open specifically during the heat of the fire. So the seeds fall onto the ground that is now bare. There is no competition for nutrients. There's no competition for water or light. So it's an ideal ground for reestablishing and rejuvenating that forest. And you can see here in different colors, different stages of forest growth. So this provides a lot of diversity actually for grazing animals. It keeps the forest young, and it protects it against diseases which an older forest will be very susceptible to. So whilst this looks kind of a destroyed landscape, it's a perfectly normal and healthy landscape. Now let's go straight to Australia. This is an image after the worst wildfire disaster in Australia, called the Black Saturday fires, in which 173 people got killed. That was in 2009, a real shock to the Australian society. And this is an image I took only about a month after the fire. We were one of the first scientists to be allowed in, and this looks really disastrous, doesn't it? It looks like the whole forest is basically dead. And whilst many people were killed in this fire, this forest is so fire adapted, most of the trees are actually not dead. They have something called epikomic growth, and that means they can shoot out new leaves straight from the bark and basically photosynthesize within days after the fire. So here's the same area. We have a research plot in here in 2017. If you don't go inside and have a look at some of the charred bark, you wouldn't know that there has been a fire. So in terms of biomass, the biomass is back, and it doesn't even take 10 years for this forest to recover. So a highly fire adapted forest. Here's another image. We've been working in the area of the Sydney's main water supply catchment with the catchment managers, because they were very concerned about water contamination from ash after this fire. And I'm just showing this image because this is 2 months after the fire. We're still in a relatively dry period, devastating fire in terms of its extent. But again, the forest here, it's recovering very rapidly. These are all relatively young trees, and all of them, or nearly all of them, have survived the fire. The ones that are being killed are usually the ones that are already diseased, or already, the ones that are usually completely charred and have no leaves anymore. They're the ones that were often dead already before the fire. Just jumping briefly to what we do here in the Centre for Wildfire Research, we focus on a whole range of aspects, one of which I just mentioned, water contamination, for example, after fire. But we also look at the social perceptions, for example. We look at the impacts on the soil. We look at the carbon cycle, something, whoops, sorry, my mouse is too sensitive. Sorry about that. We look at the carbon cycle. For example, we also look at using fire as a tool, as a management tool in the landscape, and yeah, a range of other things, remote sensing, for example. We have engineers, we have modelers, we have biologists, a number of technicians. So yeah, quite a healthy team in terms of looking at the effects of fire and trends in fire around the world. Now let's have a look at trends of fire. So climate change, of course, is a key issue I want to focus on in this presentation. I'd just like to give you some data that we collected for Lloyd's Insurance, because they're obviously very concerned as a big insurer of the risk from fire and the potential losses. And here's some data from 1901 to 2019, so over 100 years of records of natural disasters. So that's basically floods, earthquakes, fires, and basically any major disaster. So it doesn't include all the fires, it only includes fires that are considered a major disaster. So a number of people killed or international assistance being required and so on. And so basically over that whole period, we had around 4,000 individuals killed, about 6.7 million people affected by fire, and the economic damage, and this is now a few years outdated, it's gone up quite a bit, $104 billion in today's US dollars. And overall 432 catastrophic fire events, and this is basically a tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands of fire events that occur every year. Now, if you drill down a little bit, and if you're interested, you can download this report. It's publicly available that we wrote for Lloyd's. We compared this with earthquakes, for example. So here's the number of fires in this database, earthquakes and floods. And what's pretty obvious is that, of course, earthquakes and floods are more prevalent than fire around the world in terms of natural disasters. in terms of the number of people affected, in terms of millions of people affected. We have about 7 million people affected every year by fire. It's a large number, but again, so many more affected by earthquakes, and again, many more affected by floods. Many more deaths, for example, through earthquakes and also through floods. I'm just gonna do a little test with you in silence, of course, so you don't need to put anything in the chat or the questions, but just think about the personal risk of death if you are in an area that is affected by fire. Do you think the risk of death is highest in a fire, in an earthquake, or in a flood? You could do the calculations very easily, but you probably have a sort of gut feeling what it might be. Perhaps also from what's portrayed in the news. And the answer is essentially that your risk of being killed is far highest in an earthquake, for the obvious reason, because earthquakes we can't really predict, whereas both floods and fire, we have a pretty good idea where they might occur and how severe they're going to be. We don't necessarily know where exactly ignitions would be, particularly in terms of human ignitions, but we know the weather conditions under which a fire might easily ignite. So we have some ability to predict this. Now, if you, however, look at the cost per person affected, that's rather interesting, especially for the insurance industry, because of course, per individual affected, a fire event is far more expensive than a flood, for example. You might need to pump out your cellar, your insurance might be more expensive, your house might even be removed by extreme flood, but basically fires are the most destructive events in terms of personal property that you can have. Now, do we actually have a wildfire crisis? I showed you some of the images before, what we see in the news, and again, I throw that question to you now. Do you think we have a wildfire crisis? I guess from an insurance perspective, you could say, yes, it's very expensive per individual affected. If you think of numbers affected, well, 4,000, it's a bit more than 4,000 killed in extreme fires worldwide. How does that compare with the death of perhaps vehicle accidents or house fires? It's a tiny, tiny fraction of that. Of course, every single death is a disaster. But there are a number of ways to look at this. And what we've done a few years ago, we've written, like what we obviously do as academics, we write lots of scientific papers, but we wrote one specific paper and try and unravel the myths about fire, and especially the trends about fire around the world. Is fire getting worse? Are we having more people killed by fire? Do more firefighters die in fires? Are the insurance costs going up? And so on and so on. And normally when a scientific paper is being cited or being downloaded, perhaps a few hundred times, we're really proud. We think, wow, we've done a good job. Now, this particular paper got downloaded more than 30,000 times, which, you know, is nothing compared to a decent novel, but it's a scientific paper after all. So who really wants to read this? So we were positively surprised, or I should rather say gobsmacked, about how much interest this paper has actually received. But you will see in a moment why it has received so much interest. This is basically why. One of the key statements in the paper has been that we overall have a global decline, overall, on average, across the globe, in the area burned in recent decades. So basically in the last 20 to 25 years, we now have less area burned by fires than we've had in the more distant past. There has been a declining trend. And the media picked this up. Heat recedes from wildfire fears. Study, global warming isn't causing more wildfires. This is actually not at all what we wrote. It's actually the opposite. In some areas, fires are increasing very dramatically, but overall on average, and not because of global warming, because of other reasons, fire is actually getting less. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a moment. Forget the Amazon hive, fires have declined 25%. So here, this is being used to say we shouldn't worry about the Amazon. What we wrote is the opposite. You really need to worry about the Amazon fires, except that overall, on average, there has been a decline. So it's only that headline has been taken by the media. There should be one more article, if the mouse works properly. Sorry, it's not very responsive here at the moment. For example, this, for those of you who speak German, you will read that. Otherwise, this basically means that forest fires are getting smaller. This is actually the opposite what we wrote. The fires in forests have actually increased quite dramatically, but overall, because savanna fires have decreased, we have this overall global decline. So it's quite difficult to get this right. But this, for example, is another graph that was in that paper, which if you're a politician, you could use it in different ways. This is fires in the United States from 1991 to 2015. And here on the top, you see the red line. This is the number of fires. So if you wanted to say climate change doesn't exist, We have proof because the number of fires has gone down. Here's your proof, right? Proof. Of course, it's no proof. But if you look at the area burned in the United States, for example, it's gone up dramatically. It's more than doubled in the last 25 years or so. So in the United States, we have a steep increase, and even more so an increase in the cost of suppressing those fires, the line in green. So clearly for the United States, there is a big impact. And this is, of course, what we had in the paper, but who reads the whole paper? They're just interested in the headlines, unfortunately. So I don't think we've done society a favor by trying to get things right. Now, the reason for this is actually that, like everything, life is more complicated than this. So I mentioned this already. Here on this map, you can see in blue the areas where in the period 2001 to 2019, fires have decreased. So the dark blue means by 2% per year. The red means fires have increased. And on average, you can see that actually, yes, if you look at just the colors, you can see more areas where fires have decreased than where fires have increased. And this is not related to climate change. This is for another reason. These areas in the dark blue are mainly the savanna areas of Africa, some savanna areas in Australia, South America. And here we have some of the grassland areas in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. And what's been happening here is that we've basically been removing the flammable vegetation, the grassland, from that landscape and turned it largely into agricultural land that's less flammable. Nothing to do with climate change, but it's basically us removing the fuel from the landscape. So we are basically responsible for the area around the world being less in terms of fires burning. Now, this is now broken up in different areas, and let me just take you through this a little bit. So again, globally, we see this very steep decline between 2000 and 2020 here. So this is later data that's been put together also partly by our team with the most recent information. So this goes up to 2019. Here we have Alaskan forests. You can just see that every few years there's a massive increase and goes down again. So no clear trend. For the Western United States forest, quite a steep increase every year, so 1.4% every year, with a very steep increase in the last couple of years. And same thing here for the Eastern Siberian forests, a steep increase, just because the savannas are so vast that the Northern African and Southern African savannas overall drive the global trend down because they're so large, and they result in this overall global decline. In reality, we should have never actually discussed the global average in that paper. That would have prevented the media from picking it up in the wrong way. But if we go back to an earlier paper by colleagues in Canada, where they looked at climate models, what the climate is going to bring for the future, and they simply compared 3 different climate models and to see whether they agree that we get an increase in fire in the future. And that doesn't actually mean we're going to have more fire. What they looked at specifically is the fire weather. So essentially, will the weather become more extreme, meaning that if there is a fire and there is enough fuel, it'll become more severe or more extreme. And so these reds, orange and yellow basically mean that all 3 models agree, 2 models agree, and only 1 model says that. And if there were models saying that we have a decline, it would be blue here. So mostly decrease, a decrease, or undetermined. Essentially no colors in this color range here. So that basically means that back then, nearly 10 years ago, the climate models predicted we're going to get more extreme fire weather. And this is exactly what's actually happening in many places around the world. So for example, here in northern Canada or here in Siberia, we've already had an increase in average temperature of more than 3 degrees in some places, not just the 1.2 degrees we see globally. So we have an extreme increase here in fire weather. And this is accompanied by what we've seen in the previous graphs, by bigger fires and by more extreme fires. So you can say, oh yes, of course, global warming. So where we have more fire in those areas where we have still enough vegetation standing to cause fire, it's of course climate change. But of course, it's never that simple. Is climate change the reason for the increase in many forest areas? If you are an environmentalist, or if you look at the media, it's often the left trending media will say it's all about climate change. If you then look at the right trending media, basically, they would normally argue that, oh no, it's nothing to do with climate change, it's land management. And with that, let me just say a few words about land management. So one thing that's been happening, for example, if we now look at especially the southern part of this map here, the Mediterranean, Portugal and Spain together have by far the largest area burning in Europe. And the colors here have nothing to do with fire directly. These are just the blue and the red are areas in 2 different time periods where we've been changing the vegetation from cropland to grassland or forest. So we have essentially here the opposite that we have in the savanna areas. In the savanna areas, we have an increased agriculture. Here we have a decreased agriculture, and that's particularly prevalent in parts of Spain and Portugal. And this is why we see so many news about fires. Of course, climate change is happening here as well. But what's the main driver here in the Mediterranean in particular is that we're moving from an intensive smallholding agriculture, olive groves, wine, cork oak, to essentially forest plantations, because that land isn't managed with small farms anymore. The rural areas are being depopulated, people are moving into the cities, and we're therefore generating a lot more fuel in this particular environment. That's only one example, but we're clearly having, especially in the Mediterranean, a much more flammable landscape as well. And that's only one aspect of this. Of course, we humans have other impacts as well, because one thing that we're clearly seeing, and that is reflected in the skyrocketing insurance costs, is we have many more people living in what's called the wildland urban interface. We have many more people at risk. So here on the left-hand side, you can see a national park, and right at the border of the national park, you can see all these houses living in a fire-adapted forest. This forest may not burn for another 50 years or so, but fires are normal in this area. Fires will occur at some point. And so here on the right-hand side, you can see an image from the Western United States. To a firefighter or fire manager, this is an absolute nightmare scenario. This is a time bomb, because this is a fire-adapted forest. You can see in the background, fires are burning. And one thing you could, of course, do is try and put out every single fire with massive financial resources, large aircrafts that fight those fires. But ultimately, eventually, there will be a fire. And one thing that's typically happens and has happened in the Western United States for nearly a century is that they've tried to put out nearly all the fires, and by not letting the forest burn, becomes denser and denser. But of course, when you have houses in there, you have to fight the fires. So we have this situation called fire paradox, where the more you fight the fires, the more dangerous it will get for the next generation living in those houses. So the question is this really where we belong? Is this really where we should be building our houses? That really depends on your perspective of risk. We choose to live in floodplains, for example. We choose to live in earthquake-prone areas. It's just fire is perceived as such an unnatural process and such an enemy that it's often not considered a normal natural disaster. Now, let me go back to one particular fire, the Camp Fire in 2018, that some of you might remember in Paradise, California. That again shook the community in California because it caused, in a single town, it caused 85 deaths. And at the time, President Trump treated that there's no reason for these massive, deadly and costly forest fires, except that forest management is so poor. So I mentioned earlier that, of course, Trump was one of those who would deny climate change completely and just say forest management is the main cause. And of course, forest management does play a role. But of course, it's like everything, it's more complex than that. This forest near the town of Paradise had actually been managed to reduce fire risk. But Trump is simply saying the whole problem is essentially a forest management and we can fix it. And he also said we're going to have a great climate. So this obviously went ballistic, and some of us, including myself, were called out by the media and asked to comment on this. Trump is always very good to be in the media itself, and also good for us scientists, because we always had to refute whether that's COVID, whether that's wildfires, whether that's flooding. It doesn't really matter. There was always somebody willing to basically refute Trump on many of the things he said. However, he did actually have a point that, generally speaking, in the Western United States, the fire problem has become worse, partly because of climate change, which he denied, but also because of forest management, not for this fire, but for some other fires. Now, in his case, he seemed to just say that, oh, it's poor management and we should be raking our forests, which is one of the golden moments of Trump, basically, because the Finns don't rake their forests. You heard that somewhere, which is really utter nonsense, basically. And the Finns, they took to this. They're really amused by this and put lots of posts on Twitter about vacuum cleaning the forest and so on. However, as usual, there's an element of truth in this. So this must have come from somewhere. And actually, some people rake the forest. This is actually me in an Australian forest, and I am raking the forest. Why am I raking the forest? I'm not raking the forest to prevent a severe wildfire that burns through tree crowns. However, we were actually conducting an experimental fire with very low flames. And by raking the ground, you can actually stop this kind of fire. Not flames that are 10 or 20 meters high, but you can stop a fire by raking the forest if it's under very mild conditions. But of course, raking would have done nothing whatsoever to the campfire. Now, we've been asked by the Independent to comment on this because it really went ballistic, this raking the forest, and also his comment that we're going to have a great climate and forest management is to blame. And we try to be good citizens, or rather good scientists, and say, well, look, there is an element of truth in this, that forest management in the United States has played a role. We worked together with a journalist at the Independent to get this basically done overnight, so it could be published on the Sunday. So it was then published, and our comment was, yes, Trump is essentially wrong. There's not going to be a great climate, and forest management only plays a minor role in wildfires. So this is what was published. We were quite happy with it, put quite a lot of effort into this. But then at the same time, the main editor, so not the journalist who spoke to, but the main editor in charge of online news, he put this onto the app of the Independent, that we have actually said Trump is right, poor forest management is to blame. So I thought, okay, well, that didn't really work with the media. Again, a nice experience with the media. So I rang up the Independent and said, look, this is ridiculous. This is not what we're saying at all. And well, they responded very quickly and then published exactly the same piece with our wording different, that Trump is wrong. For forest management plays a minor role in wildfires. But these are the pleasures of actually working with the media, where you want to inform the public about something that may be a bit complex, but unfortunately, it doesn't always work. Having said that, most journalists that we've actually worked with, they are trying very hard to get things right. But of course, the media needs short, sharp, snappy things. And I'm sure the Independent editor thought they're going to get more readers by scientists saying Trump is right than by scientists saying Trump is wrong. There's a lot more to this story, but I don't have the time to go through this. It's rather amusing, but I do use that in lectures on this topic. So what are the solutions to this? Of course, like everything, there is no simple solution. One thing, of course, is to tackle climate change by reducing carbon emissions. That's absolutely critical. We need to do this. But of course, this will not change the situation overnight. This will have a long-term effect and will help things not getting worse. But that's all about all that can be done really on this. But there's also management. So in areas where fires are normal, like the Western United States, for example, they're trying to let them burn where they're natural and reduce the fuel elsewhere. So thin out the forest somewhere. So forest management does come into it. But also education, a very critical point. Do we really need to live in a dense forest environment? Of course, it's very pleasant to do this. And if there's a fire only every 30 years or so, but then one fire in 30 years is one fire too many if you live in that forest and you want your house not burning down or, God forbid, being killed by the fire. It's not really compatible, this fire situation, with living in some of the areas. So really, ultimately, in those areas where fires are a common occurrence, we really need to move away from fire being an enemy to simply accept the risk and adapt. And there are many, many ways of actually living also in forested areas with thinning of the trees around you, good escape routes, in the worst case, fire bunkers, which is done in some places in Australia, but also building houses that are much more fire resilient. So at the bottom here, you can see the typical United States house that's built out of very flammable, thin timber. So that's the first thing. It doesn't really go together very well. If you build your house out of very flammable material in a very flammable environment, inevitably, if there's a fire, it's very likely to then go through and burn down your house. So why is then wildfire in the curriculum at Swansea University? Well, I hope I made it clear so far that it has a lot of aspects that are relevant, and not only if you're interested in wildfire. It's just an example of a complex and impactful natural phenomenon that is very much influenced by society, and which is not easy to resolve because you will have different interest groups having very different interests, whether that's the ecology of the fire or whether that's the insurance industry, whether that's the homeowner. Of course, we all have different influences there and different views on this. It's an interdisciplinary topic with major effects on the natural environment as well as society. So it's both relevant to physical as well as human geography, for example, cultural geography, politics, and of course, climate change plays a major role here. But of course, it's not only climate change, it's land management, it's risk assessment, there are health aspects, which I haven't mentioned yet, smoke exposure, for example, social behavior, arsonists, for example, why do they set fires, and so on. So there are a whole host of aspects that can be looked at and that are also relevant in other fields, whether that's wildfire or whether that is other issues. So for example, in year one, we focus on wildfires within the course on natural hazards. So we look at volcanoes, we look at earthquakes, flooding, and so on. In year two, we, for example, have a practical where students are actually getting to burn some eucalyptus litter on soil to measure the temperature in the soil and see the impact of what might happen, both chemically and physically, to the soil. Also in our field courses, obviously during COVID, we couldn't run them, but I hope that will really change in the near future. So when students go to Vancouver, for example, Borneo or Mallorca, we discuss the impacts of fire. In Mallorca, we go specifically to an area that's recently been burned. And then at level 3, there is a specific course just on wildfires, which actually I just finished today. The dissertation, for example, some of the dissertations are carried out on wildfire, which could be, for example, on social perceptions of fire. It could be on water contamination after fire using satellite data. It could be fire impacts on carbon emissions. That's something I haven't really discussed in this particular lecture, but of course there are huge effects of fires in terms of carbon emissions as well. So with this, I thank you for your attention, and I think we do have a little bit of time for questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Stefan. Yes, I've just put in the chat. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat and we will answer them live. So we'll give you a couple of minutes if you have any questions. It's very thought-provoking because lots of people do assume that wildfires are because of global warming, but obviously it's many more factors that influence that. Okay, great. Well, you've got away likely, Stefan.
Yeah,
No questions.
Hopefully everything was so crystal clear that there are no, oh no, there's a comment. Oh, that's okay, if I can read that out for everyone, that's very nice, a nice comment of you. It's not a question. I'm a teacher and watching this makes me want to go back to university. Well, you're welcome.
Absolutely. And we have lots of academics that do outreach, and we'll do virtual sessions for schools and can actually come into schools as well if COVID allows. So if you are interested in any of our science or engineering academics coming to your school, I'll put my email address into the chat and then you can drop me a line and we can see if we can sort something out.
And I can just add here, I am doing sessions for a school in England, actually. So, and the students are fantastic. They're absolutely brilliant. I really enjoy that. So yes, so that's definitely a possibility. And now there's a really good question, which I haven't touched on, how much carbon is put into the atmosphere by wildfires. A really good question, because we're burning all this vegetation. So we're oxidizing the biomass. Carbon emissions from wildfires are roughly about 25% on top of the human emissions from burning of fossil fuels. So that's a huge amount. It's 2.2 petagrams, right? It doesn't mean much as I say it like this, but as I said, 25% of emissions from humans. But, and it's a really important but, fires generally, because they recur, like we've seen in this image at the beginning from the Canadian boreal forests, they are part of the natural environment. You have a fire and then the vegetation recovers. In Australia, within 5 years or so, all those emissions are taken up again by the regrowing vegetation. In the boreal forest, this might take 25, 30, 40 years or so, but because you always have this patchwork of burned, unburned, and burned recovering areas, that ultimately fires are considered as carbon neutral. But, and there's another big but, and there are many buts. There's another big but. If fires happen in the Amazon rainforest, or fires happen on peatland, or fires simply get bigger than they were in the recent past, like we've seen in Canada and in Siberia, we don't have that recapture of the carbon emissions into the regrowing vegetation because we're putting more out than we're taking back in. Once the rainforest is gone, it's gone. And that means that about 25% of those emissions that we have from fires are not being resequestered. So the net effect of wildfires currently around the world is actually an increase in emissions that remain in the atmosphere, even though globally the number of fires, or rather the area burned, is decreasing. right? If that makes sense. It's a little bit of a mind bender, but we're having less overall emissions from fire worldwide, but doesn't matter how much we emit globally. What really matters is how rapidly we're taking that carbon back into the atmosphere.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up for the evening. Thank you all very much for joining. Thank you to Stefan for delivering such a great talk. We do have some other webinars going on this week. If you head over to our website, www.swansea.ac.uk, you can look through engineering and science, and there are some other webinars. And then anybody who may be interested in engineering, we have an engineering taster day on Saturday, which you can also register for on our website. But yeah, thanks all for joining, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.